With the advent of yearly sports titles, Call of Duty and so on since the early 90s, we've become accustomed to buying the same game over and over, with very little difference between those 12 months. However, even this deception isn't enough for some publishers, who are more than happy to fool you into buying a game you already own multiple times. Now, I'm not talking about having to buy 2 different copies of Pokemon each generation to get the full picture. I'm talking about games that are literally the same, just given a new name, slightly different sprites, or a new piece of box art to prize poor old innocent Jimmy from his hard-earned allowance. So, this episode, we take a look at these geminated games, these profuse programs, and these septuplet softwares. As I say, but hello you. I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 times publishers fooled you into buying the exact same game twice. And sometimes even more than twice. Of course, we can't have a fact hunt on dodgy stuff going on without EA rearing their ugly heads at least once. But aside from scamming people with loot boxes and constantly biting the hand that feeds them, the House of Hawkins are also known for being the publisher to turn the lights out on a console generation, often being the company to release the final game on various systems. Now, releasing games on a dying platform may sound like a stupid business move, but it's actually highly profitable. For example, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was released on the PS2's autumn years, yet was by far the biggest selling title of all time for it, amassing an incredible 30 million copies. So it may be an older system, but it always has a far larger user base than the next generation system, and with consoles dropping in price, even going for pennies on the second-hand market, people and families of lower incomes swamp to this far cheaper library. And this is where EA come in. Wanting to sell a slightly cheaper new release to this demographic, but at the same time not wanting to fork out development costs for a whole new game, decided to come up with their Legacy series of titles, which are literally the exact same game from the previous year, just with an updated roster. This started during the PS2's generation with FIFA 14, which, is sort of acceptable, but now the PS3 and Xbox 360 are also receiving Legacy editions, consoles which could easily accommodate this as an inexpensive DLC pack. Releasing games only a $5 less than the next generation fully redeveloped versions is taking the mickey a bit. And if this wasn't bad enough, EA aren't even waiting for a console to dwindle now. FIFA 20 on the Nintendo Switch has already resorted to a Legacy edition, despite only 2 previous releases on the system. So, yeah, it's a little bit scummy of Electronic Arts to essentially double dip on older games, charging slightly less than full retail on updates they could easily release for pennies as DLC. Thanks, EA. Okay, kind of bending the rules here, as this is an arcade machine. Well, I suppose you could buy one if you've got a spare 20 grand burning a hole in your pocket. But 1994's Daytona USA was one of the most successful arcade games in history, to the point that some arcade owners stopped buying new machines altogether, as Daytona proved so financially lucrative for them. So when Sega announced a 3rd entry in 2016, they eagerly looked forward to more nonsensical NASCAR tracks, endless Sega mascot propaganda, and all while being serenaded by a man who refuses to sing Valves.
I wanna fly sky high, let's go together. I wanna fly.
However, upon Daytona 3's eventual release in June 2017, they were subjected to an abysmal looking game. Something that would have looked a bit crap on an iPhone 10 years ago. I mean, even Sega themselves reluctantly admitted the game was absolute trash, as they later dropped the 3 from the title and rebranded it to Daytona Championship USA. But aside from the terrible aged graphics, the one thing that irked players was the fact the game just didn't feel like Daytona. The steering felt off, yet strangely familiar. And that's because of one blatantly obvious thing. Daytona 3 isn't a sequel at all. It's literally a reskin of the Dreamcast game Daytona USA 2001. Yep, Daytona 3 is literally a 2-decade-old Dreamcast game, just upscaled into widescreen with a new skin slapped on top. Heck, it's such a lazy port, they couldn't even be bothered to change the blooming music in it. There's also one more colossal screw-up Sega did with Daytona 3, but I'll save that gem for a future episode. Or it's in my book if you want to read about it now. What do you do when you spend a fortune developing a video game based on the latest hot TV show, only for the creators to force you into cancelling it? Why, you regurgitate it into a bunch of other licenses you got on the cheap, of course. And that's exactly what happened with the Game Boy Color port of South Park. When the tykes from Colorado were the hot thing to watch on the old telly box, Acclaim snapped up the rights to make an FPS using the Turok engine on the Nintendo 64. A nerfed port of that for the PlayStation 1, and a pretty decent Lost Vikings knockoff for the Game Boy Color. However, rumour has it that South Park's creators, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, weren't too keen on the idea of releasing a Game Boy Color port, as they felt the handheld was a children's system by then, and Acclaim, not wanting to anger their meal ticket, reluctantly agreed. Shame really, as it was a fun little puzzle game that, dare I say, was far more entertaining than its Big Brother's outings, as the 2 future South Park games Acclaim made were pretty dire too. However, that didn't stop them from recycling the hell out of the code. The first Doki Doki panicking of the Game Boy Color South Park was in the guise of Maya the Bee. Now, Maya is one of those properties that's huge in some parts of the world, but completely unheard of in other countries. But Maya the Bee is in fact based on the 1912 German's children's book created by author and professional Michael Corleone lookalike, Waldemar Bonzels. He was also an anti-Semitic pro-Nazi, but if you create something profitable, corporate has a way of hiding that past. Hey. Now, you might be more familiar with the 2012 CG series of Maya the Bee. However, the game was released in 1999, and the last TV era of Maya at the time was the anime series produced 24 years prior in 1975. So it's obvious Acclaim got the IP on the cheap. But even the Big A knew the property was practically unheard of at the time, so they rejigged the graphics for its second iteration, and this time based the game on America's favourite genetic clones, Mary-Kate and Ashley. A blatant attempt to throw any old crap at the code if ever I did see one, considering there's only 2 girls, yet you play as 3 characters in the game. Oh, the girls suddenly inherit a dog out of nowhere as a 3rd member, in case you're interested. However, this laziness seems to have paid off for Acclaim, as the game sold well enough to receive a sequel in the form of The New Adventures of Mary-Kate and Ashley. Well, I say sequel, it could be considered an add-on pack by today's standards, just a previous game with new levels. In hindsight, this wasn't really Acclaim trying to double-dip their consumers, more them trying to pull back potential losses a massive license would have brought, by slapping 2 cheapo ones on it in its wake. Yeah. Our next entry is less about fooling people into buying the same game twice, and more taking the absolute piss. Now, some of you may remember I spoke about NINJABREAD MAN in the very first episode of Fact Hunt, where I mentioned that the game was originally going to be a third title in the Zool series. But, long story short, Zool franchise owners Zoo Digital commissioned developer Data Design to make a new entry in the 90s Ninja Gremlin mascot bandwagon jumping series. But were so appalled by its quality, they axed the game entirely. Unfortunately for them, Data Design had ploughed a ton of their own money into the game, so not wanting to go bankrupt, they kept the Candyland theme still, but simply replaced the Ninja Gremlin, that definitely isn't an ant, with an anthropomorphic biscuit, releasing it in 2005 as NINJABREAD MAN on the PS2 and PC, and again in 2007 on the Nintendo Wii. However, as infamous as NINJABREAD MAN was, Data Design wanted more. But rather than develop a whole new game, they literally just replaced the textures of the levels and enemies, replacing the Kung Fu cookie with a jackal deity, and released it as Anubis II. Then again as Mythmakers Trixie and Toyland, and again as Rock'n'Roll Adventures. Oh yes, Data Design managed to release the exact same rejected game a whopping 4 times. In fact, they were so lazy at re-releasing the game over and over, they couldn't even be asked to replace the soundtrack half the time. I mean, who cares if it's completely ill-fitting to the game's theme? Ironically, saturating the market with cloned shovelware was incredibly profitable for Data Design, to the point by 2007 they had become the largest publisher for the Nintendo Wii, claiming a massive 40% of the entire market. Fortunately, all bad things must come to an end, as the death of the Nintendo Wii also brought about the death of the shovelware market. So, with no system to bombard crap with, Data Design folded in 2012. So, don't hold your breath for an HD NINJABREAD MAN with new Funky Kong mode for the Switch anytime soon. Let's round off today's episode with a story of not only the time they tried to sell you the worst soccer game ever made, twice, but also a tale of negligence, cover-ups, lawsuits, and ultimately bankruptcy. Now, back in the early days of gaming, sports games entirely consisted of coloured stickmen kicking a square around the screen. They were barely identifiable as human beings, let alone recognisable sports stars. So, obtaining a licence for a sports game was not out of fear of being sued, just to shift a few more copies through brand recognition. And that was just the case when US Gold obtained the rights to the 1986 Mexico World Cup, the first ever officially licensed FIFA game in fact, beating EA by 7 years. Now, there's a fact I bet you didn't know. Anyhow, because US Gold were half owned by Ocean Software, the plan was they'd collaborate on the project together, with Ocean developing a World Cup edition of John Rickman's most excellent match day, and US Gold publishing the title. However, in a huge bout of stupidity and ineptitude, Ocean not only completely forgot about the deal, but US Gold never bothered chasing them up on their progression either. So when they came knocking 3 months before the World Cup's kickoff and discovered Ocean hadn't even started on the game, to say they were shocked is a little bit of an understatement. US Gold quite rightly panicked and begged the entire gaming industry for an alternative. Obviously no one in their right mind wanted to develop a AAA game with less than 6 weeks of development time, so their calls went unanswered. That was until a developer on their last legs approached them by the name of Arctic Computing. Arctic thought they could simply rename a football game they'd released 2 years prior called Arctic World Cup Football for them. Money for old rope. Unfortunately, Arctic World Cup Football was renowned for being an absolutely terrible game, even by 1984 standards, and US Gold were fully aware of this. They knew they were about to push out a duffer, but what other choice did they have? So they desperately tried to polish this turd by sticking a couple of posters, a sew-on patch and some stickers in a box, praying no one would notice. And, of course, they did. Reviews were even more scathing than before, absolutely eviscerating the game. No one was fooled at being sold not only an awful 2-year-old game, but one that's now £8 more than what you could buy the original for by then. Copies were returned to stores in droves, and US Gold's rather tepid already reputation for releasing quality titles was left in tatters. US Gold did try some damage control, first coming up with the programmer they hired to make the game gave them such a terrible product, they had no other choice but to release Arctic World Cup. And when that old chestnut failed, they proclaimed, yeah, it is a different game, look, it comes with a poster and stickers. Duh! But US Gold never once pointed a finger of blame at Ocean, for obvious feeding and biting reasons. And want to hear the most insane part of this whole story? Arctic Computers never even owned the rights to Arctic World Cup football to begin with. They had sold them to media distributors Prism Leisure a year before to keep the company afloat. So when Prism learned about Arctic's blatant bout of perjury, they immediately sued them for all the profits they had made off World Cup Carnival, instantly bankrupting the company. But in a huge twist of unfitting non-punishment, US Gold ended up coming out of the whole ordeal smelling of roses. Due to the FIFA license, World Cup Carnival ended up becoming the biggest selling home computer game of 1986. And on top of that, all negative press was instantly washed away, as US Gold also released the legendary golf game Leaderboard that same month. So magazines shoved all negativity into tiny print in small back page articles, not wanting to upset the publisher. Gaming journos, eh? They never change. US Gold would go on to try and obtain the Italia 1990 World Cup rights too. But after the abysmal quality of World Cup Carnival, FIFA awarded them to Virgin Games instead. The ironic thing about this whole situation was while US Gold's game was a fully original title, Virgin's World Cup game was just a renamed version of Rick Davis's World Trophy Soccer. Just no one really cared as the game was pretty decent this time. So maybe there was karma here after all. Hello you. Thanks ever so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to be first to see future Fact Hunt episodes. Click on the bell if you already are to make sure you're notified, and be sure to check out my other episodes. And if you want to be super awesome, check out my Patreon. But thanks again for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Ta-ra for now.